Story recapped here. Today I'm going to explain a horror film called Daughters of Satan. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. Somewhere in Manila, Philippines, the leader of a coven of witches punishes one of their members who lost her way. The leader then forces the woman to recite the 9 names of the principal powers of darkness, making sure she'll never forget them again. Meanwhile, an art collector and museum curator named James Robertson visits an antique store to buy a painting. He then finds one that depicts the burning of 3 witches and a dog at the stake, leaving him in awe because one of the women looks exactly like his wife, Chris. Moments later, the store owner, Carlos Ching, who's expecting James's arrival, approaches him. They talk about a tapestry that James hopes to buy, but upon seeing it, he immediately becomes disappointed. After that, he turns to the painting he saw earlier and asks Carlos to share with him its story. Then, upon learning that the painter created 6 illustrations showing different views of that incident, James decides to buy it. Later on, James goes home and shows Chris the painting, making his wife feel uncomfortable. Chris wonders why James would bring home something like that, pointing out that it's even badly painted. But James thinks the painting is different and special. However, all Chris can focus on is how the painting shows sadism. Then, suddenly, Chris states that the painting is about the burning of 3 Duarte Coven witches in 1592, unsure why she knows that. As if Chris isn't anxious enough, James points out how she looks exactly like the witch in the middle. But Chris doesn't want to talk about the painting anymore, so James just fixes her a drink before putting the painting away. That night, as Chris is about to sleep, she suddenly hears someone calling her name. She then stands by the window to see who it might be, but she doesn't know anyone outside. Realizing that Chris isn't in bed, James gets up and asks his wife what's wrong. So, Chris explains that someone is calling her, but James doesn't hear anything. To calm Chris down, James decides to go out with his gun and look for whoever is disturbing his wife. However, Chris stops him and says maybe she's just imagining things, eventually urging him to go back to bed. The following day, Chris stares at the painting and cries as she realizes that the witch in the middle does look like her. Then, she notices a dog outside their house and calls its name despite seeing it for the first time. The dog has a collar that shows its name, Nicodemus, leaving Chris wondering how she knows that. But suddenly, the dog runs away, so Chris tries to follow it. However, Chris eventually loses the dog and just decides to return home. On the other hand, James notices that the dog faded from the painting. He then asks Chris about it, and they get into a small argument when he once again points out her resemblance to the witch. Still bothered, James asks his wife if she erased the dog from the painting, leaving Chris annoyed that he thinks she would do such a thing. Then, James mentions going to the library and learning that Chris is right about the date of the burning, wondering how she knows an obscure thing like that. However, Chris simply says she must have read it in a novel somewhere, but James doesn't believe her. So, Chris tells her husband that sometimes things just stick in her mind. The next day, a woman named Juana Rios shows up at the Robertson residence in response to a job advertisement she claims Chris posted. However, Chris denies posting the ad, but she realizes it must be James's doing and lets Juana inside the house. Chris then shows Juana around the place, and they end up in James's office where the housekeeper sees the painting that Chris hates. As Juana stares at the painting, Chris notices that she looks exactly like the other witch. Because of that, she tells Juana she no longer wants a housekeeper and tries sending her away. Unfortunately, Juana simply tells Chris that she has no choice, adding that she's there to help her fulfill her destiny. Juana then shows Chris an antique dagger, but she doesn't say what it's for. Meanwhile, James finds Nicodemus in the middle of the road and swerves to avoid hitting the animal. Then, he tells Chris all about it when he gets home, saying the dog looks exactly like the one in the painting. On the other hand, Chris informs James that they have a new housekeeper. As they talk, Juana lets Nicodemus inside the compound and the dog almost attacks James. Thankfully, Chris manages to stop the dog, but it isn't long before it breaks free from her grasp. Nicodemus then tries going for James, who quickly gets inside his car as he holds a wrench for protection. Hearing the commotion, Juana calls the dog and makes it sit in front of her, angrily asking James what evil thing he's done to make dogs hate him. The hostility is thick in the air, and James sarcastically says his favorite holiday dish is baked dog. However, Chris knows that isn't true, and as James enters the house, Juana finally leaves with Nicodemus. Later on, James notices that one of the witches in the painting faded too. Puzzled, James calls his colleague Vicente and tells him that 2 figures from the 370-year-old painting he bought suddenly faded. After their conversation, James notices that something is burning outside, so he decides to investigate. He then sees some women standing near a campfire, but as he approaches them, they suddenly vanish. Confused, James tries to see where they went, but several guerrillas suddenly ambush him. The guerrilla leader asks James if he knows who he is, and when James tells him he doesn't, the man says that's good news because it's a matter of life and death. He then makes it clear that he'd love to shoot James, but he eventually lets him go and urges him to return to his house. When James gets home, he immediately tells his wife what he saw. However, Chris is acting a bit strange, just staring out the window and crying. She then tells her husband that she feels so down, so James tries to comfort her. The next day, James goes to the address of Nicodemus's collar and finds himself in a mortuary. There, a mortician prepares for the burial of a dead woman who was tortured to death by her coven. James then walks into the room and asks the mortician where the address of Nicodemus's collar is and says that the dog has been bugging him. So, the mortician tells James where to go, and as he leaves, he fails to notice the coffin being made for him. Upon finding the right address, James realizes that he's been looking for Carlos Ching's antique store all along. However, James finds Carlos dead with a dagger plunged into his heart. He then tries calling for help, but a man suddenly attacks him from behind. Luckily, James manages to escape, but as he gets in the back of a passing pickup truck, the man chases him with a dagger in hand. After kicking some boxes out of the truck, James successfully hits the man and eventually loses him. Unfortunately, 2 more men start coming after James, leaving him no choice but to run and get inside a moving jeepney. Later on, James visits a psychiatrist, Dr. Dangal. First, James tells the doctor about Nicodemus and how the figures in a painting he bought suddenly faded. Then, James mentions that one of the witches in the painting looks like Chris, while the other looks like Juana. Lastly, he shares with Dr. Dangal that he found Carlos stabbed to death, wondering if he's been hallucinating, but the doctor assures him that he isn't. Then, as they talk, one of Dr. Dangal's patients, Kitty Duarte, bursts into the room. She also happens to be the leader of a coven of witches, but no one knows about that. Kitty tells Dr. Dangal that she desperately needs him, saying some sort of power is forcing her to do evil things. But the doctor simply tells her to wait until the session with James is over, leaving Kitty no choice but to leave. Meanwhile, James can't help but stare at Kitty, which Dr. Dangal notices. Despite finding it weird, James confesses to the doctor that Kitty looks exactly like the third witch in the painting. Because of that, Dr. Dangal instructs James to call him if anything else happens. Dr. Dangal then says he's sorry that Chris stopped coming to their sessions despite making progress, so James tells him that he'll make his wife return for therapy again. A few days later, James and Chris decide to spend some time by the river. There, Chris tries to stab James with the dagger as he talks about the painting, but she just can't find the right time to end his life. James then gives Chris's necklace with a cross pendant back to her, causing her to come to her senses and drop the dagger. Later that evening, as Chris prepares to sleep, she once again hears a voice calling her name. So she quietly gets up and opens the door, surprised to see Juana standing there. The housekeeper gives Chris a small pouch to purify the air, saying she'll know what to do with it. Then, before Juana leaves, she instructs Chris to take off her cross, pointing out that she might break the chain while she's asleep. Once Juana is gone, Chris takes off her necklace and immediately feels different. It's as if Chris just released a dark side of her that she's been trying to contain, and as she gets a glass of water and places it on the nightstand, it is obvious that she wants to harm her husband. Then, Chris takes out what's in the pouch and puts it inside the glass, causing the water to emit smoke. After that, Chris quickly leaves the room and goes outside, waiting to see what will happen to James. Meanwhile, James finally wakes up and staggers out of bed, struggling to open the window as he suffocates. With no other choice, James breaks the glass window with a chair, which helps Chris to snap back to reality. She then immediately runs upstairs to check on her husband, relieved that he's okay. One day, Dr. Dangal visits James at home and finally sees the painting he's been talking about. He then realizes that James wasn't exaggerating when he said the 3 witches look like Kitty, Chris, and Juana, and at the same time, he's curious about Nicodemus. He explains to James that Nicodemus is a kind of animal with supernormal access to evil things, even to the devil himself. In other words, the witches communicate with the devil through the animal. Unfortunately, as they discuss all the odd things happening around James, Dr. Dangal starts to suspect that Chris is being possessed. However, James refuses to believe that, unable to think that Chris would even try to harm him. So, Dr. Dangal points out how bright the colors in the painting are at the moment, saying it's because the 3 witches and the dog are sleeping. Dr. Dangal also tells James his theory that whenever the colors fade, it means the witches have left the painting. Seeing that James still doesn't believe him, Dr. Dangal just warns him to be careful once Chris's colors fade. That night, Dr. Dangal lets James go to bed as he stays behind in his office to study the painting. Then, the doctor suddenly has a vision and sees how the witch is burned at the stake with Nicodemus. So, he immediately takes the Virgin Mary statuette, causing the vision to finally stop. After that, Dr. Dengel informs James that he's leaving, and once he's gone, James witnesses how Nicodemus and the witches fade from the painting one by one. He then checks their bedroom and realizes that Chris left her cross, and as if that isn't enough, he discovers that Juana and Nicodemus are gone too. Meanwhile, as Dr. Dengel drives home, he gets another vision and sees the shadowy figures of the witches dancing in the middle of the road, followed by Nicodemus. He then tries to make an audio file of what he just witnessed, while on the other hand, James finds Juana back in the house. Chris is back in bed too, but as James looks closely at his wife, he notices her feet are dirty. At the same time, Kitty kills Dr. Dengel by making his car explode. Later on, after Dr. Dengel's funeral, Kitty tries to seduce James. However, James immediately sees right through her and tries to leave. So, Kitty stops him and mentions having the same painting he has that depicts the burning of 3 witches, only it's from a different view. James then follows Kitty and sees the painting in her bedroom, which shows another angle of the incident. In this painting, James notices that he looks exactly like Diego Robertson, the man who ordered the witch's execution. He also learns from Kitty that Robertson might be his ancestor, listening as she reveals that all the women Robertson ordered to be executed had their revenge on him and his male descendants. After some time, the coven gathers and decides to punish Chris for failing to kill James. Kitty then burns Chris's cross before they string her up, torturing and forcing her to recite Lucifer's prayer. After that, Kitty orders Chris's release and gives her a wooden cross, instructing her to spit on it to prove her loyalty to Satan. With no other choice, Chris unwillingly spits on the cross and cries, feeling helpless. Then, Kitty shows her James's coffin, saying everything is up to her now. When Chris returns home, she drugs her husband and places him in his car with Juana and Kitty's help. They then take him atop a precipice and place ice blocks beneath his car's tires, intending to make the vehicle go over the cliff by evening. Moments later, Kitty and Juana meet with Chris in a local bar, where they wait for James to die. By midnight, the 3 women suddenly come out of a trance and Juana introduces herself as Armenia Raimundo, a registered nurse. On the other hand, Chris is concerned about James, thinking that something terrible happened to him. So, Kitty and Juana take Chris home, where she finds her husband alive. Although he's still a bit dizzy, James recalls escaping the car before it went over the cliff. James then carries Chris to their room and lays her on the couch, and at the same time, he notices that Nicodemus no longer hates him. Unfortunately, James's nightmare isn't over yet. The witch in the middle of the painting suddenly fades, and with tears in her eyes, Chris stabs her husband to death.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.